They said I'd never amount to anything. That I was the weak one, the failure, the shame of the family. But when the most powerful man in the nation looked me in the eyes and said, "You saved more lives than you'll ever know," every insult they ever threw at me disappeared. Judgment has a way of settling into your bones when it comes from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. It doesn't shout, it lingers. It hides behind comparisons, subtle tones, disappointed looks, and unspoken expectations. It becomes the language of your upbringing, a silent vocabulary of inadequacy that shapes your perception of yourself long before you've had the chance to form your own truth. To be called worthless isn't always done in clear words. Sometimes, it's felt in every sigh when you enter the room, in every opportunity you were never offered, in the way praise was reserved for others while your effort was met with silence. You're labeled before you even understand what labels are. You're assigned a place in the family story and it's always at the bottom. The burden of being less than begins early, and it never asks if you agree. That weight doesn't just sit on your shoulders, it rewires how you think. You begin to monitor every action, every word, every step, trying to minimize the criticism. You start to anticipate judgment before it arrives. You shrink your ideas before sharing them. You lower your volume so your presence doesn't seem like an inconvenience. You stop reaching for more because somewhere inside, you've already accepted that more was never meant for you. Being the one they underestimated doesn't happen because of failure, it happens because they decided that your difference meant deficiency. You weren't loud enough, bold enough, smart in the way they respected. You weren't fast to conform. You didn't mirror the version of success they admired. You became the scapegoat for their own insecurities, the mirror they didn't want to look into, the one who made them uncomfortable by existing outside their narrow framework. The comparisons start early, too often so subtly that they seem harmless. "Why can't you be more like is?" said with a smile, but it plants a seed that grows into self-doubt. It teaches you that being yourself is insufficient, that the standard is someone else. Every compliment aimed at others becomes a reminder of what you're not. Every mention of another's achievements echoes as an accusation. You start living in the shadow of their favorites, a space that's cold, dim, and suffocating. And yet, you try to earn what should be freely given. You try to impress, to prove, to measure up. You pour yourself into tasks that they'll never value. You excel in areas they don't recognize. You hope that maybe one day, the weight will lift. That they'll notice your effort. That you'll finally hear the words you've never been given. But they never come. Instead, they find new ways to remind you that you're still not enough. The criticism isn't always loud, often it's passive. It's in the jokes that dig deeper than they admit. In the dismissals, when you speak up. In the absence of encouragement, when you're clearly struggling. It's the moments you needed support and were met with silence. The times you needed comfort and were given correction. The days you accomplished something meaningful only to be met with indifference. Over time, the internal becomes more punishing than the external. Their voices become your own. You start repeating their doubts as if they're your thoughts. You question your worth before anyone else gets the chance to. You downplay your dreams before anyone else can shoot them down. You learn how to stay invisible, not because you want to be, but because invisibility hurts less than rejection. You notice how your role in the family becomes fixed. You're the disappointment, the one who never got it right, the one who makes bad decisions, the one who always needs help, even when you don't ask for it. They reduce you to your worst moments and ignore your progress. They tell stories about you that no longer reflect who you are, but they're invested in those stories. Because if you grow, they have to confront what they missed, and that's uncomfortable. Judgment creates isolation. Not just physically, but emotionally. You're in the same rooms, but you're not part of the same conversations. You're part of the family, but not part of the pride. They celebrate others publicly and critique you privately. Or worse, they critique you publicly too. In front of relatives. In gatherings. As if you're a cautionary tale rather than a living, evolving person. Your dignity becomes disposable if it entertains them or makes someone else look better. There are moments where you begin to internalize a harsh truth. Love, in your world, was conditional. You were loved only when you performed a version of yourself that they could accept, and even then, it was reluctant. The authentic you, the flawed, learning, growing, misaligned version, was never truly welcomed. You learn to mask your emotions, to fake stability, to pretend it doesn't hurt when they overlook you. You laugh with them at your own expense. You become complicit in your own dismissal, but the pain of being constantly judged by your own blood, creates something beneath the surface. A silent fire. A need not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. Not to win their approval, but to escape their limitations. You begin to dream of spaces where you are not reduced to your past, where your worth is not tied to how easy you are to manage, where your identity is not shaped by the ones who misunderstood you. This buried judgment follows you into the world. It affects how you approach relationships, how you view authority, how you navigate challenge. You're always half apologizing, half hoping. Even in your victories, you wait for someone to invalidate them. Even when praised, you wonder if it's real. You've spent so long under the weight of not being believed in, that even belief feels like a trick. But underneath it all, you remain, not broken, just buried. Beneath the layers of shame, criticism, and judgment is someone still alive with purpose. Someone who was told they were nothing, but who was quietly becoming more than anyone expected. Not because of the judgment, but in spite of it. Not to prove something to them, but to reclaim something for yourself. That's where the shift begins. When you stop living in reaction to their labels. When you stop holding your breath, waiting to be accepted. When you stop twisting yourself to fit into the story they wrote about you. You realize that their judgment says more about their limits than yours. That their inability to see your value doesn't mean it isn't there. That being misunderstood doesn't make you unworthy. What they called weakness was resilience. What they mocked as failure was foundation. What they saw as drifting was direction they couldn't understand. What they dismissed as delusion was vision in its earliest form. And as you carry that history forward, it no longer drags you down, it propels you. You use it not as a wound, but as wisdom. You become someone they never imagined, because you stopped trying to become what they wanted. You rose from the judgment they used to hold you down. And one day, without needing revenge or recognition, your existence becomes your answer. ***, choosing your own path is one of the boldest acts of especially when no one believes in it but you. It means trusting your instincts when the people closest to you see your choices as foolish. It means walking forward without applause, without guidance, without reassurance. It means becoming your own source of validation when the only feedback you receive is dismissal, skepticism, or silence. There is a particular kind of strength that grows when you move toward something meaningful in the face of constant disbelief. When your family expects you to fail, every step forward feels like rebellion, not because you are defying them out of pride, but because you are refusing to become the version of yourself they settled for. They painted you as the one who couldn't get it together, and then you chose a path they didn't understand, a decision they labeled as proof of your irresponsibility, recklessness, or naivete. But the truth was deeper than they would ever grasp. You weren't trying to escape reality. You were building a new one, a life that didn't rely on their limited vision. They wanted something safer for you, something predictable, something respectable in their eyes. A career they could understand, a lifestyle they could brag about, a path that made sense within their framework. So when you stepped outside that framework, when you chose something unconventional, uncertain, or unglamorous, they didn't see potential. They saw failure waiting to happen. Their fear disguised itself as concern. Their judgment wrapped itself in advice. Their doubt came dressed as care. But care doesn't suffocate. It doesn't shame. It doesn't mock your dreams and call it love. Real care makes space for difference. Real love doesn't need to control the outcome to remain present. What you were given, instead, was a conditional form of belonging, one that depended on whether you fit the mold they crafted. And when you didn't, they began to distance themselves from your choices, treating your ambition like a phase, your work like a distraction, your purpose like an accident. Still, you kept going. Not because it was easy, but because something inside you refused to live a life shaped by someone else's expectations. There was a calling louder than the noise of criticism, a knowing deeper than their opinions. You weren't chasing approval anymore, you were following alignment. You were chasing something real, even if they couldn't see it, especially because they couldn't see it. Still, you kept going. Not because it was easy, but because something inside you refused to live a life shaped by someone else's expectations. There was a calling louder than the noise of criticism, a knowing deeper than their opinions. You weren't chasing approval anymore. You were following alignment. You were chasing something real, even if they couldn't see it, especially because they couldn't see it. The path you chose may not have come with prestige or instant validation. It may have required sacrifice, isolation, and quiet perseverance. It may have looked unimpressive on the outside, especially to those who equate success with status. But it gave you something you never had under their judgment, a sense of self. It gave you purpose. That wasn't performative. It gave you the chance to prove to yourself, not to them, that you are capable of building something from nothing. This kind of path doesn't come with shortcuts. It comes with resistance. Not just from others, but from within. Because when no one believes in you, you have to confront your own self-doubt in ways most people never do. You have to build faith in silence. You have to continue even when results don't show up right away. You have to hold your vision steady while everything around you suggests you should let go. You have to trust the value of something long before it proves itself to anyone else. That's what most people miss when they talk about success. They talk about outcomes. But the hardest part is the middle, the part where belief is your only fuel. Where discipline replaces praise. Where you keep showing up, not because anyone is watching, but because you promised yourself you wouldn't quit. It's in that middle space that character is forged. In the repetition of work that goes unnoticed. In the thousands of unseen hours spent learning, failing, adjusting, refining. What they called a mistake was actually a foundation. What they mocked as weakness was resilience in its rawest form. What they dismissed as wandering was direction they couldn't comprehend, because not all roads are linear. Not all progress looks neat. Some journeys require dismantling everything you were taught so you can build from a place of truth. And the truth is, your path didn't need to make sense to them, it only needed to be yours. They weren't there when you struggled with doubt. When you questioned your worth, when you stood at the edge of giving up. They didn't see the nights when you sat with failure and decided to keep going anyway. They didn't witness the quiet breakthroughs, the internal shifts, the slow victories that weren't loud enough for social media or family updates. They don't know the discipline it took to keep going when you had no audience, no encouragement, and no safety net, and that's okay. Because this path wasn't for them. It wasn't a performance. It was a reclamation. A return to the parts of yourself they tried to bury under shame. It was the space where you learned that worth isn't proven through titles, salaries, or external praise. It's revealed in how you respond to being doubted. In how you rise after being dismissed. In how you continue to believe in your own potential, even when others refuse to see it. There is a quiet power in choosing yourself. In making decisions rooted in authenticity instead of fear. In building a life that reflects your truth, not someone else's projection. There is a quiet rebellion in refusing to let your family's limitations become your identity. And that rebellion, when sustained with integrity, becomes legacy. The most transformative part of this journey is that it teaches you how to define success on your own terms. No longer filtered through their lens. No longer based on what impresses them. You begin to see value in growth that's invisible to others. You begin to recognize strength in your own evolution. You stop chasing their approval and start cultivating your own peace. The distance from their praise becomes your freedom. They may still not understand what you're doing. They may still speak with condescension, offer backhanded compliments, or question your choices. But your relationship with those opinions has changed. You no longer flinch when they doubt you. You no longer shrink when they speak over you. You don't need to defend what they'll never understand. Their approval is no longer required for your self-worth to exist. Eventually, the world begins to notice what they never could. Not because you sought attention, but because real impact doesn't stay hidden forever. The results of your quiet work begin to surface. The people you've helped, the lives you've changed, the value you've added, it all begins to take shape. And while they may be surprised, you are not. Because you know what it took. You know how much of yourself you gave to something they never even believed in. You walked the path no one supported. You built from a place no one respected. And you did it without bitterness. Without the need to prove them wrong. Because the real victory was never about them. It was about becoming someone you could respect. Someone you could believe in. Even if no one else did. Asterisk, asterisk, there is a point on any journey when what once felt like sacrifice becomes second nature. When the discomfort, the long hours, the endless expectations begin to feel less like pain and more like purpose. When the hardship doesn't break you, it builds you. Not in a way that calls for recognition, but in a way that forges you into something unshakable. You stop counting the cost, not because it stops being difficult, but because something more meaningful begins to take root. Impact. When the world doesn't see your intention, the work still matters. The mission becomes internalized. It stops being about proving anything to anyone and starts becoming about doing what needs to be done because you can, because you must. That's when your identity stops revolving around rejection and starts forming around quiet responsibility. No longer driven by what others expect, the fuel now comes from the clarity of knowing who you are and what you're meant to carry. Doing something meaningful in silence becomes its own form of power. You show up when it's hard. You continue when no one's watching. You serve where it's needed, not where it's celebrated. You don't need to be seen to do what's right. And in that commitment, you start to realize something. The very traits they once mocked are the traits that sustain real impact. The emotional depth, the endurance, the sensitivity, the compassion, those are not weaknesses. They are strengths that others never had the patience to understand. The work, whatever form it takes, service, defense, care, leadership, protection, begins transforming you from the inside out. You begin to see what they never taught you, that your value is not tied to how easily you fit into someone else's system. That worth isn't handed to you by family praise or inherited by default. It's earned in silence. It's tested in isolation. It's affirmed in every moment you choose duty over ego, substance over image, contribution over comfort. You begin to carry weight others can't imagine. Responsibility that doesn't show up on paper. Situations that demand more from you than any title could represent. People come to you in their most broken moments, and you hold them without needing to be thanked. Lives are changed because you stepped in when others walked away. Crises are diffused because you stayed steady. Challenges are overcome because you refused to let your fear speak louder than your integrity. It is in these moments, real, heavy, and sometimes thankless, that you find something you never had under judgment. Dignity. Not the kind others grant you, but the kind you build within. Dignity forged through service, through honor, through the decision to keep showing up, especially when it's hard, especially when you're tired, especially when you have every reason to quit. There is something sacred in doing the right thing even when it goes unseen. You begin to understand what leadership really is. It's not about being celebrated, it's about being relied on. It's not about the spotlight, it's about showing up when others don't. It's about becoming someone people can trust. Not because of your image, but because of your presence, your values. Your follow-through and still. Your family knows none of it. They're far away, not just in distance, but in understanding. They see your title and assume it means nothing. They hear your role and reduce it to something simple. They ask surface questions and offer surface praise when it's convenient, but they do not see the depth. They still operate from the story they wrote about you long ago. And you've long since outgrown that version. But you don't correct them, not because you don't care, but because you no longer need them to understand in order to keep walking your path. You've become content with being your own witness. You've become fluent in self-respect, and most of all, you've become anchored in the truth that some stories don't require retelling because the evidence of your transformation is now visible in the lives you've touched, in the systems you've changed, in the strength you've built. Service, in any form, has a way of revealing character. When others flinch, you step forward. When others doubt, you hold steady. When others ask why, you already know. The impact of your work might not be broadcasted, it might not come with applause. But the difference is undeniable. And more importantly, it is yours. You begin to look around and see the contrast between who you were told you were and who you've become. The disconnect is undeniable. You were labeled as weak, but you've carried the burdens of others with grace. You were told you were lost, but you've found your calling through the work. You were told you'd never do anything meaningful, and now you're doing what many wouldn't even dare to attempt. Every hour spent in service has been a quiet reclaiming of your worth, a reminder that your story was never meant to fit into the confines of their expectations. That you were never broken, just different. That your value was never missing, just misread. That your path was never the wrong one, just one they couldn't follow. In the line of duty, you've encountered pain, struggle, and moments that test your humanity. But you've also encountered strength, growth, and resilience you didn't know you had. You've seen the worst of circumstances, and still chosen to show up with compassion. You've faced pressure and still operated with principle. And in all of this, you've found a version of yourself that no family insult could ever erase. Because real identity is born in struggle. It is shaped in service. It is refined in the fires that others avoid. And by choosing to do the hard thing, the thankless thing, the necessary thing, you have become someone your past critics could never recognize. They may have called you worthless, but the work has proven otherwise. They may not understand your contribution, but the world is different because of it. And while they sit comfortably in their assumptions, you carry the quiet truth. You have saved more, helped more, changed more than they will ever know. And that truth, steady, silent, and strong, is no longer something you need them to see. Because you've seen it for yourself. And that is more than enough. There is a unique kind of weight that builds over time when everything you've done is either dismissed or unseen. It settles in the space between what you know you've become and what they continue to believe about you. It creates an invisible distance between you and those who once had the power to define your identity. A gap between your truth and their perception, and for the longest time, you carry that burden quietly, trying not to let it alter your focus. Though it presses against your chest like an unspoken wound. You don't set out for validation, not anymore. You stopped chasing their praise when you realized it was built on conditions. You stopped seeking their respect when you understood it was filtered through limitations they never questioned. But even still, there remains a small ache, not for approval, but for acknowledgement, a desire not to be celebrated, but to be accurately seen, to have the full scope of your journey recognized, even just once, without distortion or denial. So when that recognition finally comes, and not from those who belittled you, but from someone far removed from your story, it lands with a kind of force that redefines everything. It doesn't arrive as flattery or sympathy. It comes as clarity, as truth spoken aloud, without hesitation, as someone of power and authority, someone outside your family's limited scope, finally articulating what you've always known, deep down, that you are more than what they called you, that you have done more than they ever imagined. This moment does not erase the years of judgment, but it shifts the power away from those who misjudged you. Because when someone who doesn't owe you anything, someone with no emotional bias, no family connection, no need to flatter, acknowledges your worth, it affirms a truth that had been long buried under layers of criticism. It confirms what you've spent years proving through action, not words. It speaks directly to the part of you that stayed quiet, resilient, and focused while being constantly underestimated. The recognition doesn't need to be grand in gesture. Its impact lies in its legitimacy. It comes not from sentiment, but from merit. It's earned, not gifted. It is spoken from a place of respect that was never offered to you by those closest to you. And in that moment, something inside you shifts permanently, not because you needed their voice to believe in yourself, but because it exposed the full scale of how wrong your family had been. It becomes clear then, that those who called you worthless were never qualified to define your value. They spoke from their own limitations, not from any true understanding of your capacity. They mocked what they couldn't comprehend. They belittled what they feared. They ignored what didn't reflect their version of success. But the world, beyond their narrow lens, saw you clearly and honored you for what you've done, what you've endured, and what you've become. Recognition, in this form, is more than a moment. It is a turning point. A permanent removal of the old narrative. The story they told about you, the one you were always fighting to escape, begins to collapse under the weight of undeniable truth. The words spoken by someone respected, powerful, and neutral become louder than all the whispers that once reduced you. The lies about who you were can no longer hold. There is power in being validated by someone who has no reason to flatter you. Someone who has seen your results, your sacrifice, your outcomes, and names them as worthy, noble, extraordinary. When they speak those words aloud, it's not just about recognition. It's about liberation. It's the moment your work is pulled out of the shadows and into the light. The moment your legacy begins to detach from family memory and attach to the truth of your impact. And yet, the most profound change doesn't happen in the room where recognition is given. It happens in the silence afterward. In the way you hold your head differently. In the way your inner dialogue evolves. In the way you revisit old memories and finally see them for what they were. Not reflections of your inadequacy, but reflections of others' inability to see your worth. In the way you stop explaining yourself, stop shrinking, stop waiting for anyone to admit they were wrong. You walk into the next chapter of your life, no longer carrying the shame they tried to bury you in. You carry confirmation instead. You no longer second-guess your strength. You no longer filter your decisions through the fear of being misunderstood. You don't need to prove anything anymore, because the highest authority in the room said it for you. And that voice drowned out all the ones that used to define your silence. Recognition doesn't heal every wound, but it gives clarity to your scars. It reminds you that pain has not been your only legacy. That despite the weight of rejection, you created something enduring. That even in the absence of support, you stood your ground. that even when dismissed, you delivered. That in the very spaces where you were expected to fail, you rose, not with arrogance, but with excellence. Those who once doubted you begin to feel the shift to, they can no longer joke about your failures. They can no longer ignore your results. They can no longer pretend you are the same person they kept boxed in. And whether they acknowledge it or not, they now have to sit with the truth, that while they were busy criticizing, you were out changing the world. While they were focused on your past, you were building a future they'll never be able to take credit for. There is a quiet satisfaction in that realization. Not revenge, not smugness, just justice. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken. The kind that lives in your calm, your certainty, your groundedness. You don't need to argue anymore. You don't need to defend your life to people who never tried to understand it. You don't even need their apology. Because the recognition they never gave you has already arrived from someone whose words actually carry weight. And in that, you find peace. Not the kind that forgets the pain, but the kind that finally lets it go. You no longer live trying to prove you're enough. You live knowing that you always were. And now, the world has seen it too. Asterisk. There comes a point in every journey where the desire for recognition dissolves not from bitterness, but from clarity. You no longer seek applause from those who never clapped when you needed it most. You no longer reach for validation from voices that only spoke when you were at your lowest. You no longer crave praise from those who used your struggles as punchlines. Something deeper begins to take root, an unshakable understanding that your worth was never theirs to define. You begin to realize that applause is loud but short-lived. It fills rooms but not hearts. It is fleeting, conditional, dependent on timing and mood. But self-respect turned through discipline, endurance, and silence is permanent. It is quiet, but it echoes in everything you do. It does not rise and fall with public opinion or family consensus. It is stable, rooted, and unbreakable. And in that space, you stop needing anyone else to announce your arrival. When you know what you've overcome, no one else needs to know. When you understand the depth of your growth, silence from others no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like peace. You stop translating their indifference as a reflection of your progress. You stop interpreting their coldness as your failure. You see their distance for what it is, a boundary created by their discomfort with your evolution. The most profound transformation happens not when others finally praise you, but when you realize their praise was never necessary. It is in that moment that you gain everything they withheld from you, not through their hands, but through your own resilience. You begin to walk with a kind of still confidence that needs no spotlight. The confidence of someone who has already faced the worst and kept going. The quiet assurance of someone who knows exactly who they are. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending your choices to people who never listened in the first place. You stop trying to rewrite the family narrative that cast you as the failure. You stop expecting them to see your light when they've spent years pretending it wasn't there. You stop waiting for the conversation where they finally say, "You were right." Because you already know you were. And that knowing is enough. Freedom comes when you no longer measure your success through the lens of people who measured you unfairly. When you let go of the version of yourself they created, the one that always needed to prove something. The one who kept showing up, hoping they would change. The one who stayed small just to avoid another round of criticism. That version slowly dissolves, replaced by a self-built identity that owes no explanations and no apologies. They may never admit they were wrong. They may never say your name with pride. They may continue to share old stories, frozen in a time when you were still uncertain, still growing, still vulnerable. But those stories no longer define you. They are chapters from a book you've already rewritten. Their version of you is outdated. It belongs to a time before you found your voice, before you claimed your path. Before you became someone even they could no longer ignore. You begin to value solitude over shallow connection. You choose depth over drama. You choose boundaries over belonging that comes with conditions. You stop attending every conversation that invites you to shrink. You stop sitting at tables where love is earned through silence. You understand that some distances are not punishment, they are protection. And some losses are not failures, they are freedom. There's a serenity in realizing that your progress doesn't need to be televised to be real. That your growth doesn't need to be noticed to be valid. That you don't need to be featured in their conversations to be fulfilled. You've built a life outside of their vision, and it thrives not because of them, but without them. And that, in itself, is the most powerful recognition of all. You no longer fantasize about the moment they say they're proud of you, because you are proud of yourself. For surviving what you never talked about. For healing what they never acknowledged. For rising after they left you behind. For becoming more than what they believed you could be. You are your own evidence. You are your own witness. You are your own applause. And from this place of calm strength, something shifts. You begin to wish them well, not out of obligation, but from a distance that no longer requires their involvement. You stop holding on to grudges that keep you tethered to the past. You release the emotional contracts that kept you waiting for what never came. You forgive not because they earned it, but because you deserve peace more than you deserve closure. There is grace in letting go, not as an act of defeat, but as a declaration of freedom. You no longer need to be included, understood, or celebrated by those who refused to see you in your wholeness. You carry your own wholeness now. You've repaired the parts of you they fractured. You've restored the self-esteem they tried to erode. You've rebuilt your foundation with your own hands. Your victories now speak for themselves, not through words, but through presence. Through the way you walk into a room. Through the way you protect your peace. Through the way you carry yourself with dignity that no longer wavers in their silence. Through the way you respond with compassion instead of defensiveness. You've become someone they never expected because you stopped needing them to believe in you first. They may still look at you through the lens of who you used to be, but your energy no longer fits their memory. You've evolved beyond their understanding. And you no longer seek to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding. You no longer seek to convince those who need you to stay small for their comfort. The applause that once seemed essential now feels hollow, because the real reward was never in being recognized. It was in becoming whole. In finding peace where there used to be pain. In feeling rooted where there used to be restlessness. In knowing that your value is not up for debate, not up for consensus, not up for negotiation. You become a living contradiction to their assumptions. A quiet testimony to what happens when someone refuses to let rejection define them. A reminder that strength doesn't always shout and that the most powerful growth happens in silence. And so you walk forward. No longer looking back for applause. Because the future is full of open roads, unclaimed joy, and purpose that doesn't rely on anyone's permission. You've already earned your freedom not in a single moment of recognition, but in every moment you chose to keep becoming even when no one believed you could. You don't need their applause. You've already outgrown their silence.